mid-14th century, one of the worst pandemics in world history, a bacterial infection known as the Black Death.
It began like a whisper on the wind and ended in a scream. It came without warning. A shadow swept across continents, tearing through cities, farmlands, and forests with a speed and brutality the world had never seen. In the span of just 6 years, between 1347 and 1353, a mysterious killer erased nearly 2/3 of Europe's population. Streets turned silent, families vanished overnight, and the living dug graves faster than they could mourn. This was no ordinary disease. This was the Black Death. And once it arrived, there was no going back. Death moved faster than whispers. Fear spread faster than the plague itself. Known by many names, the Great Mortality, the Pestilence, the Plague, it became a defining horror of the medieval world. In towns from Florence to London, Paris to Prague, bodies piled high while doctors, priests, and kings watched helplessly. Some thought it was divine punishment. Others blamed foul air, foreign enemies, or angry stars. But all they really knew was this: it killed without mercy, without pause, and without explanation. No one was safe, and nothing made sense. Hope rotted faster than corpses. When the dead outnumber the living, everything changes. Entire economies collapsed. Trade routes fell silent. Villages were abandoned. And when the wave of death finally subsided, the survivors emerged into a different world. With so many dead, labor became scarce. Empires weakened, and a new social order began to rise from the ashes. Feudalism cracked. Religious faith was shaken. The Renaissance soon followed, as if civilization had inhaled death and exhaled rebirth. Out of ruin came revolution. Chaos became the architect of change. But through all that loss, one question never died. Yet despite its apocalyptic impact, the plague left behind more questions than answers. For over 600 years, scientists, scholars, and skeptics have hunted the truth. Where did this invisible killer come from? What force could have sparked such unimaginable destruction? Textbooks offered guesses: China, India, Crimea, but the evidence was always fragmented, incomplete, and frustratingly vague. The story had a beginning, we just hadn't found it yet. The truth was buried, but not forever. Sometimes, history hides in the most overlooked places. Now, thanks to a shocking convergence of forgotten archaeology and cutting-edge DNA science, the silence is finally breaking. It turns out, the key to unlocking the Black Death's origin wasn't hidden in medieval manuscripts or ancient myths. It was etched on a single weathered gravestone, high in the mountains of Central Asia. A word carved in stone, a word we all fear: pestilence. And that single word is about to rewrite history. The door to history's deadliest mystery just creaked open. The silence has ended. The truth is calling. And what lies beyond that door changes everything we thought we knew about the past, and possibly the future. A forgotten graveyard, a chilling inscription, and the first clue in a centuries-old cold case. Sometimes, the past whispers through forgotten stones. In the summer of 1886, a team of Russian archaeologists set out to explore a pair of modest cemeteries near the village of Karajigak, nestled in the rugged terrain near Lake Issyk-Kul in present-day Kyrgyzstan. At first glance, it was an unassuming sight, dusty, remote, and forgotten by time. But what they uncovered there would prove to be one of the most overlooked historical clues in the story of the Black Death. What seemed like a footnote would soon become a headline. Truth waits in the dirt. A single word can outlive an empire. These were the graves of a small, once thriving Christian trading community, a branch of the Silk Road that pulsed with goods, stories, and disease. The archaeologists unearthed dozens of headstones, each one marked with a name, a date, and in several cases, a single, ominous word: pestilence. Most striking were the years, 1338 and 1339. This was nearly a full decade before the plague ever reached the shores of Europe. It wasn't just early, it was the beginning. A single word can echo for centuries. Some discoveries are made, only to be forgotten. To the archaeologists, it was curious but not urgent. They noted the findings, boxed the bones, and shipped them to a museum in St. Petersburg. There they were labeled, shelved, and slowly forgotten. For more than 100 years, these remains sat in quiet obscurity, their secrets sealed behind glass and dust. No one imagined they were holding the genetic fingerprint of history's most feared pandemic. And yet, behind museum glass, the truth waited. Lost evidence doesn't stay lost forever. Real discoveries begin with a second look. Then came Philip Slavin, a medieval historian with a curious mind and a nose for anomalies. While combing through economic data and archival records, Slavin stumbled upon references to the 1886 excavation. Something didn't add up. A sudden, localized mortality spike in a remote Silk Road outpost just before the Black Death? He pored over field notes, gravestone inscriptions, and death records, realizing this wasn't a coincidence, it was a crisis. And this crisis had left behind a paper trail. Patterns hide in plain sight. Data means nothing without someone willing to ask why. Over 118 burials in 2 years, many with the same cryptic inscription. Slavin suspected he had found the origin point, but suspicion is not proof, not without hard science. Still, his research caught the attention of paleogeneticists and global media alike. As CBS News, ABC News, and Nature would later report, these forgotten graves were far more than just ancient history. They were the starting line of the deadliest race humanity ever lost. A silent cemetery had just become the loudest clue in history. A silent village may have spoken the first word of a global tragedy. What comes next will connect bones, bacteria, and a buried beginning. The scientists take over. DNA will speak where history once fell silent. The bones are about to tell their story. Sometimes, science is the only voice the dead have left. When Philip Slavin pieced together the strange puzzle surrounding those ancient graves, he knew he was onto something, but historians work with stories, not proof. To confirm what he believed, that the Black Death began here, he needed science to speak where history fell short. That call was answered by the paleogeneticists at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology in Germany. Their mission? Unlock the microbial secrets hidden in medieval teeth. And what they found would rewrite the history of disease. The past is trapped in enamel. Beneath enamel lies a frozen battlefield. Working with Russian curators who still held the 1886 remains, the team selected 7 individuals buried near Lake Issyk-Kul between 1338 and 1339. They didn't need full skeletons, just teeth. Deep inside the dental pulp, bloodborne pathogens can remain sealed off from oxygen and decay for centuries. The researchers drilled into the teeth with surgical precision, extracting ancient DNA that had been sleeping for nearly 700 years. Tiny traces, monumental consequences. Centuries-old blood speaks in code. Sometimes, history confesses in a single molecule. What they found was breathtaking. In the remains of 3 individuals, they identified unmistakable traces of Yersinia pestis, the bacterium responsible for the Black Death. It wasn't just a fragment or a partial match. This was a complete genetic fingerprint, a smoking gun. For the first time, science had caught the killer red-handed right at the scene of the crime, nearly a decade before it reached Europe. The killer had a name, and now it had a birthplace. One name, one killer, Yersinia pestis. But the story doesn't end with identification, it begins there. The team then compared the DNA to a global database of plague genomes, over 1,300 strains gathered from rodent burrows, archaeological sites, and human remains across centuries. That's when the breakthrough happened. Around the early 1300s, Y. pestis had undergone a dramatic genetic burst, a so-called Big Bang. 4 major lineages exploded from a single ancestor. And the DNA from Kyrgyzstan? It matched that ancestor perfectly. This wasn't just old plague, it was the original plague. This was patient 0. The ripple started in Kyrgyzstan, but the wave drowned a continent. This wasn't just an early strain, it was the strain, the mother of all pandemics. Every later outbreak, including the Black Death that devastated Europe and lingered for centuries, descended from this singular genetic source. As natureandscience.org confirmed, the graves in Kyrgyzstan weren't a random hotspot. They were ground zero, the very root of history's darkest epidemic. From the tooth of a merchant to the fall of nations, the data drew a straight line from a forgotten grave to global devastation. Now that we know where it started, one question remains: how did it escape? How this microscopic killer jumped from wild animals to humans, triggering the chain reaction that changed the world forever. Every pandemic begins with a jump. Before the Black Death tore through Europe, before cities were emptied and bones piled high, it began as something far smaller, a shift in nature. High in the Tian Shan Mountains near Lake Issyk-Kul, the bacterium Yersinia pestis lived quietly, circulating among wild animals. Marmots, gerbils, and voles formed a natural reservoir, carrying the plague without knowing it. Here, in this rugged wilderness, the seeds of apocalypse lay buried in fur and fleas. And all it needed was one moment to break free. The wilderness was never innocent. Nature doesn't need armies to start a war. The region had always been a balancing act of predator and prey. But in the early 1302, something changed. According to scientists, and as reported by Science.org and ABC News, a sudden climatic shift brought unusually warm and wet seasons. Grass and vegetation flourished, rodent populations exploded. With them came more fleas, more bites, and more chances for Y. pestis to find a new host. A thriving ecosystem became a breeding ground for death. Climate can be a killer. One bite can reshape the world. Picture a trader hunting a marmot, common practice at the time. He skins the animal, unaware of the infected flea clinging to its fur. It bites. The bacterium enters his bloodstream. Days later, he's feverish, then coughing blood. Then he's gone. But by then, the flea has already moved on to his family, to fellow traders, to the next village down the Silk Road. This wasn't a mythical curse, it was zoonotic spillover. A chain reaction triggered by a single life taken. A thriving world became a deadly one. The Silk Road carried more than silk. This wasn't an isolated community. The people of Karajigich were traders, part of a global network. Camels came and went. Goods from China, Persia, and Europe passed through their hands. When the infection struck, it struck travelers. The death toll rose rapidly over 2 years. Tombstones spoke of pestilence, but the world wasn't yet listening. The storm had begun, quietly and far from the centers of power. One bite, one breath, one mistake. What began in a rodent's bloodstream now moved through veins of empire. From the burrows of marmots to the blood of merchants, the plague crossed species, then borders. The leap had been made. Yersinia pestis had found its way into humanity, and from there, it was unstoppable. The plague had legs now, and it was heading west. One village, at the center of a global web. The next chapter isn't just about infection, it's about transmission. How the plague hitched a ride across continents, turned war zones into petri dishes, and ignited the deadliest pandemic the world had ever known. What begins in silence can echo across the world. Once Yersinia pestis made the jump into humans, it didn't stay hidden in the mountains of Kyrgyzstan. It began to move slowly, methodically, invisibly. This was no isolated tragedy. This was the beginning of a global catastrophe. Traders, unknowingly infected, set out along the arteries of the ancient world, the Silk Road. In their baggage were silks, spices, and rats. And in those rats, the future of Europe was already dying. Trade carried more than spices. The plague's journey was no accident, it followed human ambition. The people of Karajigak were part of an international web of trade, stretching from the Mongol Empire to the Mediterranean. Camels carried goods westward, passing from hand to hand. Along with those goods came fleas, clinging to rats nestled among crates and furs. It was a slow-motion catastrophe, a silent march of infection. Step by step, the disease moved from Central Asia to the ports of the Black Sea. Commerce had become the plague's perfect disguise. Contagion can ride in a crate. Then came the siege that changed everything. In 1346, at the Crimean port city of Kaffa, Mongol forces surrounded the city. But they weren't just armed with weapons, they had something far worse. As Science.org recounts, the Mongols began hurling the corpses of plague victims over the walls using catapults. It was one of history's first recorded acts of biological warfare. Inside the city, panic spread faster than the infection. Genoese ships fled the port, and carrying the plague with them. The plague had found its ship, and Europe was its next harbor. War doesn't always kill with weapons. What took years to travel now took weeks. From Constantinople to Messina, Marseille to Venice, the disease raced through ports like fire through dry grass. Genoese ships became floating coffins. As CBS News and Science.org explain, Europe, densely populated, unsanitary, and rat-infested, was a paradise for the plague. Rats scurried through homes, marketplaces, and churches. Fleas jumped from fur to flesh. Within months, entire cities collapsed under the weight of their own dead. The world had been connected. Now it was contaminated. The world shrank, and so did its population. And it all traces back to one forgotten grave. That weathered tombstone near Lake Issyk-Kul, carved with the word pestilence, is no longer just an archaeological curiosity. It's a marker in the timeline of humanity. Thanks to modern science and tireless research, we now know exactly where and how the Black Death began. What started in a remote trading post became one of the most important genetic and historical discoveries of our time. From silence to science, the mystery has been solved. Ground Zero is no longer speculation, it's science. But this isn't just a story about the past, it's a warning for the future. The Black Death showed how connected, vulnerable, and unprepared humanity can be. And today, with new zoonotic diseases emerging in an ever-shrinking world, that lesson is more relevant than ever.